The village of Apon sat between a thick forest and a wide, winding river. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where news spread faster than the Harmattan wind. The people of Apon were hardworking, farmers, hunters, and fishermen who respected tradition. Elders told stories in the evenings, and children ran barefoot through the dusty paths, their laughter filling the air. Among these people was Aduni, a young woman with a quiet strength. She was neither the most beautiful nor the most outspoken, but she had something that made people admire her: kindness. She greeted the elders first thing in the morning, helped mothers carry heavy baskets from the market, and shared food with anyone who had little to eat. Her father, Baba Ade, was one of the most respected hunters in Apon. He was known for his skill with a bow and for his wisdom, but he was also a man of firm beliefs. He often told Aduni, "A woman must marry a man who can provide. Love is good, but love does not fill an empty stomach." Aduni never argued, but in her heart she wondered, was love really so weak? Not far from Aduni's home, near the riverbank, lived Dimeji. He was a fisherman, just like his father before him. Every morning, before the sun stretched its arms across the sky, Dimeji was already at the river, casting his nets. The water was his companion. He knew its moods, its depths, and its secrets. Some days, the river was generous, filling his nets with fish. Other days, it was stingy, giving him only a few. But Dimeji never complained. He believed that hard work and patience were enough to survive. Dimeji and Aduni had known each other since childhood. They had played together, raced along the riverbank, and listened to the elders' stories under the moon. But as they grew older, things changed. Aduni was now of marriageable age, and the whispers had started. Who will she marry? Her father will choose a rich man. The trader from the next village is interested in her. Dimeji heard these whispers, and they made his heart heavy. He had loved Aduni for years, but he knew he was not the kind of man Baba Ade wanted for his daughter. A fisherman was not rich. He had no barn filled with yams, no goats tied in the compound. He only had his nets, his canoe, and his love. But was love enough? One evening, after selling his fish in the market, Dimeji walked to the riverbank, hoping to find peace in the gentle waves. He was surprised to see Aduni sitting on a rock, her feet dangling above the water. "You are far from home," he said, stepping closer. She turned and smiled. "So are you." Dimeji sat beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sky was turning orange and purple, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and distant cooking fires. Aduni broke the silence. "They say my father is looking for a husband for me." Dimeji's hands tightened into fists. "And what do you say?" She shrugged. "Does it matter? He will choose." Dimeji looked at her, trying to find the right words. What if you had a choice?" She smiled again, but this time it was sad. "Then I would choose someone who understands me. Someone who will not only provide, but will also stand beside me, not above me." Dimeji's heart pounded. What if that person has no barn of yams, no herd of goats, only the promise to never let you go hungry? Aduni turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Are you asking me, or are you telling me?" Dimeji swallowed hard. "Both." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle lapping of the river. Then Aduni said softly, "I cannot answer a question you have not asked my father." Dimeji exhaled, nodding. He had always feared approaching Baba Ade, but now he knew he had to. He could not let someone else take Aduni away while he stood by, silent and afraid. The next morning, as Aduni fetched water from the village well, she overheard two women talking. "They say the rich trader from Itu is bringing gifts for Baba Ade." "Ah, Aduni is lucky. She will never know hunger." Aduni bit her lip. She did not want to be ungrateful, but something inside her resisted. She knew the trader. He was older, with 3 wives already. He was rich, yes, but he had no kindness in his eyes. Later that day, when she returned home, she found her father sitting under the big tree in their compound, sharpening his hunting knife. She hesitated, then sat beside him. "Baba, if I marry, what do you wish for me?" Baba Ade paused, then said, "A man who can protect and provide for you." "What about love?" He chuckled. "Love is sweet, but it does not put food on the table." Aduni sighed. She wanted to believe love and survival could go together, but she also knew her father was not wrong. That evening, Dimeji stood outside Baba Ade's compound, his heart pounding. He held a small, carved wooden fish in his hands, a symbol of his trade, his promise. He knew the conversation ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that some things were worth fighting for. As he stepped through the gate, he whispered a silent prayer to the moon, the same moon that had watched over him and Aduni since they were children. Dimeji took a deep breath as he stepped into Baba Ade's compound. The air was thick with the smell of roasting yam, and the evening fire cast long shadows on the ground. He could hear the soft murmur of voices from inside the hut, but it was Baba Ade he had come for. The old hunter sat under the large mango tree in the compound, sharpening his hunting knife. His muscles, though aging, were still strong from years of pulling a bowstring and chasing game through the forest. His eyes were sharp, always watching, always judging. Dimeji swallowed hard, gripping the carved wooden fish in his hand. It felt small, almost childish, but it was all he had to offer. "Baba Ade," he greeted, bowing slightly as respect demanded. The older man didn't look up. "Dimeji, what brings you here at this time?" Dimeji cleared his throat. "I have something to say." "Then say it." For a moment, Dimeji hesitated. He had practiced this moment in his mind many times, but standing in front of Baba Ade now, all his words felt foolish. Still, he forced himself to speak. "I wish to marry Aduni." The sharpening stone stopped moving. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs from the river. Baba Ade lifted his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Dimeji's. "You wish to do what?" Dimeji swallowed. "I love her. I will take care of her." Baba Ade let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "A fisherman? You want to marry my daughter?" Dimeji clenched his jaw, but remained silent. Baba Ade placed his knife down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me, Dimeji, what do you have to offer her? Do you have a barn full of yams? Do you have goats, cows, land?" Dimeji lifted the wooden fish. "I have this." Baba Ade stared at it for a long moment, then burst into laughter. "A wooden fish? Are you mocking me?" "No, Baba," Dimeji said firmly. "I carved this because it represents my trade. A fisherman does not store yams in a barn, but he always has food from the river. Aduni will never go hungry with me." Baba Ade's laughter faded, replaced by a frown. "What happens when the river is empty?" "Then I will learn the ways of the hunter," Dimeji answered without hesitation. "Because a man does not sit and cry when one path is blocked, he finds another way." For the first time, Baba Ade seemed to consider him. He rubbed his chin, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and stretched. "Come back tomorrow," he said simply. "I will have an answer for you then." Dimeji wanted to ask more, to push for a response now, but he knew better. Baba Ade was a man who moved at his own pace. With a respectful nod, he turned and left the compound, his heart beating fast. That night, Baba Ade sat outside his hut, staring at the moon. Aduni came out quietly and sat beside him, waiting. She knew her father well. He would speak when he was ready. "Dimeji came today," Baba Ade finally said. Aduni's heart skipped a beat. "I know. He wants to marry you." She stayed silent. "What do you think of that?" Aduni hesitated, then said softly, "I think Dimeji is a good man." Baba Ade sighed. "A good man, yes, but a poor man. Can he take care of you?" She looked at her father. "What is care, Baba? Is it only food and shelter?" "It is survival," he answered, "and love does not put food on the table." Aduni smiled faintly. "Neither does wealth if a man does not love his wife." Baba Ade turned to her, studying her face. "You love him?" She met his gaze. "Yes." The old hunter sighed again, rubbing his forehead. He had expected this, but hearing it from her own mouth made it real. He had always known Dimeji was a hardworking man, but marriage was not just about hard work. It was about security. Still, something about the young fisherman's words stayed with him. A man does not sit and cry when one path is blocked. He finds another way. Baba Ade looked at his daughter. "Go to bed, Aduni. I will think on this." She nodded, rising to her feet. "Good night, Baba." As she walked inside, Baba Ade stared at the wooden fish Dimeji had left behind. He turned it over in his hands, deep in thought. The next afternoon, while Aduni was grinding pepper outside the hut, a commotion came from the entrance of the compound. A group of men approached, led by a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in fine embroidered cloth. His wrists were heavy with gold bracelets, and behind him, his servants carried baskets filled with yam, kola nuts, and cloth. It was Alau, the wealthy trader from Apetu. Baba Ade stepped forward to greet him, a look of curiosity on his face. "Allow," he said, "to what do I owe this visit?" Allow smiled, his teeth shining like polished ivory. "I have come with good news, Baba Ade. I seek your daughter's hand in marriage." Aduni, who had been listening quietly, felt her stomach twist. She lowered her head and continued grinding, though her hands trembled. Baba Ade looked at the gifts, then at Allow. "You have brought many things." "A wife deserves comfort," Allow said proudly. "Aduni will never lack anything. My barns are full, my trade is prosperous. She will eat the finest food, wear the finest cloth." Baba Ade nodded slowly. "And what of love?" Allow chuckled. "Love? What is love, Baba Ade? A hungry woman does not eat love. A tired woman does not sleep on love. I will give her a good life." Aduni's hands stilled on the grinding stone. She had never met a man who spoke of love like it was a useless thing. Baba Ade was silent for a moment, then he said, "Return in 3 days. I will have an answer for you." Allow smiled, bowing slightly. "I look forward to it." As soon as he left, Aduni turned to her father. "Baba, you cannot." Baba Ade raised a hand, stopping her. "I have not decided yet." But he speaks as if love does not matter. Baba Ade sighed. "Aduni, life is hard, love is sweet, but it cannot carry a family." She took a deep breath. "And if a man's wealth disappears, what will carry a family then?" Her father did not answer. He simply turned and walked inside, leaving her to her thoughts. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Baba Ade gathered the elders of the village. He told them of his dilemma. 2 men seeking his daughter's hand. One, a poor fisherman with a strong heart. The other, a rich trader with a full barn, but little concern for love. The elders listened, nodding thoughtfully. Finally, the oldest among them, Baba Ojo, spoke. "Let them prove themselves," he said. "A man is not only measured by his wealth, but by his strength and wisdom. Set a task, and let them show who is worthy." Baba Ade nodded slowly. Yes, this was the way. And so it was decided. Dimeji and Allow would face 3 tests. The man who succeeded would earn Aduni's hand. As the night deepened and the fire crackled in the compound, Aduni sat by herself, watching the flames. Somewhere by the river, Dimeji was probably preparing himself. She whispered into the night, hoping the wind would carry her words to him. "Be strong." Dimeji woke before the sun rose, just as he always did. But today was different. Today was not about fishing. Today, he would step into a world he barely knew, the world of the hunters. The village had already begun to stir when he made his way to Baba Ade's compound. The news of the test had spread quickly, and curious eyes followed him. People whispered as he passed. "Do you think he can do it?" "He is only a fisherman. What does he know about hunting?" "The trader will win. He has strength and servants to do things for him." Dimeji ignored them. He was not here to prove himself to the village. He was here for Aduni. When he arrived, he found Baba Ade waiting, his hunting bow slung across his back. Beside him stood Allow, the wealthy trader. Unlike Dimeji, who wore his simple fishing tunic, Allow was dressed in expensive cloth. His boots were polished, his confidence unshaken. Baba Ade cleared his throat. "You both claim to be worthy of my daughter, but a man is not measured by words. Today, you will hunt. Whoever returns with the biggest catch proves he can provide." Allow scoffed. "This is easy. I have hunted before." Dimeji said nothing, but his hands clenched. He had never held a bow before. The river had always provided for him, not the forest. Baba Ade handed each of them a bow and a quiver of arrows. "You have until sunset. May the best man win." Dimeji stepped into the forest, his heart beating fast. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and leaves. Birds called out from the treetops, and somewhere in the distance, he heard the rustling of small animals. He gripped the bow tightly, trying to remember how he had seen hunters hold it. He had watched Baba Ade and the other men return from hunts with wild antelope and bush meat, but he had never learned their ways. Allow, walking a few steps ahead, glanced back with a smirk. "Are you sure you don't want to give up now, fisherman?" Dimeji ignored him and kept walking. They moved deeper into the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. Soon, Allow disappeared in another direction, leaving Dimeji alone. Dimeji crouched near a fallen tree, listening. He knew that patience was key in fishing, and maybe it was the same with hunting. He could not chase the animals. He had to let them come to him. After a while, he spotted movement in the bushes. A small antelope, its ears twitching. Dimeji slowly raised his bow, pulling the string back the way he had seen hunters do. His fingers trembled. He aimed carefully and released the arrow. The arrow flew too high. It struck a tree, sending the antelope running. Dimeji exhaled sharply. He had failed, but he would not stop. He picked up another arrow and kept moving. Meanwhile, Alao had found his own prey. He spotted a large bush pig drinking from a stream. Smiling, he raised his bow and let the arrow fly. It hit the pig's side, but not deep enough to bring it down. The wounded animal squealed and charged. Alao's smirk vanished. He turned to run, but the uneven ground caught his foot. He fell, landing hard on his back. The bush pig ran past him, disappearing into the trees. He cursed under his breath, brushing dirt off his fine clothes. He was not used to failure. But there was still time. He would find another animal. Dimeji knew he needed a different approach. He was not a skilled hunter, but he was a fisherman, and fishing had taught him one thing: how to use bait. He searched the ground until he found a small cluster of ripe fruit. He gathered them and placed them near a clearing, then climbed a tree, bow in hand. He waited. Minutes passed, then a rustling sound. A large rabbit hopped into the clearing, sniffing the fruit. Dimeji held his breath. Slowly, he raised the bow, steadied his hands, and released the arrow. It struck true. The rabbit twitched, then lay still. Dimeji let out a relieved sigh. It was not a great catch, but it was something. As the sun began to set, both men returned to the village. A small crowd had gathered to see the results. Alao arrived first, carrying a bird he had managed to shoot in the last moments. He walked proudly, despite the scratches on his arms and dirt on his clothes. Then came Dimeji, holding his rabbit. The people murmured. The bird and the rabbit were similar in size. Baba Ade examined both catches carefully. He looked at Alao. "You are an experienced hunter, yet you bring only this." Alao frowned. The forest was unkind today. Baba Ade turned to Dimeji. "And you, the fisherman, who has never hunted before, manage this." Dimeji nodded. "I may not know the ways of the hunter, but I know patience. The forest, like the river, rewards those who wait." Baba Ade nodded slowly, impressed despite himself. "This test is a tie," he announced. "Tomorrow, we begin the second test." As the crowd dispersed, Aduni caught Dimeji's eye and gave him a small, proud smile. Dimeji felt his heart swell. He had not won yet, but he had not lost either. And that was enough for now. The night after the hunt was restless for Dimeji. Though he had held his own against Alao, he knew the next test would be even harder. Baba Ade had not yet revealed what it would be, but Dimeji could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He sat outside his small hut, staring at the river. The moon cast a pale light on the water, making it shimmer like silver. This river had always provided for him, had always been his home. But now, it felt like an uncertain friend. His mother, Mama Dimeji, came out and sat beside him. She was a small woman, her back slightly bent from years of hard work, but her spirit was strong. "You are thinking too much," she said, her voice gentle. Dimeji sighed. "Baba Ade will test me again tomorrow. I do not know what he will ask of me." Mama Dimeji smiled faintly. "You are a fisherman, my son. Whatever the test, remember who you are." Dimeji nodded, but deep inside, doubt lingered. The next morning, the village gathered again in Baba Ade's compound. Alao arrived in a fresh set of expensive clothes, as if yesterday's struggle had not happened. He stood tall, his confidence undiminished. Baba Ade stepped forward, his expression serious. "The second test is not about hunting or wealth," he said. "A man must protect what he loves, even in the face of danger. Today, you will prove if you can stand strong when the storm comes." Murmurs spread through the crowd. What did he mean? Baba Ade continued. "There is a storm coming tonight. I have sent my men to remove the roof of one of the village huts. You two will stay inside that hut through the storm. No matter how heavy the rain, no matter how strong the wind, you must not leave. If you do, you fail." The crowd gasped. The coming storm was no ordinary one. The elders had already spoken of dark clouds rolling in from the west. It would bring heavy rain, strong winds, and even lightning. Dimeji's heart tightened. He had spent many nights on the river during storms, but never without shelter. Alao frowned. "This is madness. How does enduring a storm prove I am worthy?" Baba Ade's gaze was firm. A man who cannot stand in the storm cannot stand for his wife and family. Alao muttered under his breath, but he could not argue in front of the whole village. The challenge was set. As evening fell, thick clouds gathered in the sky. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of rain and damp earth. The villagers retreated into their huts, preparing for the long night ahead. Dimeji and Alao stood before the small hut Baba Ade had chosen. The roof was gone, leaving only 4 mud brick walls. The inside was empty, except for a wooden bench and a mat. Baba Ade stood at the entrance. "Once you enter, you cannot leave until sunrise. If either of you runs, he is not worthy of my daughter." Dimeji nodded. Alao muttered something under his breath, but stepped inside. The hut was quiet as they sat on opposite sides. Neither spoke. Outside, the wind began to howl, rattling the walls. Then the rain came. At first, the rain was steady, tapping against the mud walls like fingers drumming on a drum. But soon, it turned heavy, pouring in thick sheets. The wind screamed, rushing through the open space where the roof should have been. Within minutes, they were soaked. Water pooled on the dirt floor, and the cold crept into their bones. Alao cursed under his breath, wrapping his fine cloth tightly around himself. "This is foolish," he spat. "What does this prove? Any man with sense would seek shelter." Dimeji said nothing. He was cold, but he had learned patience from the river. He sat still, his arms wrapped around himself for warmth. Lightning flashed, followed by a loud crack of thunder. The walls trembled slightly. Alao shivered. "This is madness," he muttered again. Another gust of wind tore through the hut, and suddenly part of the mud wall cracked. A section crumbled, leaving a gaping hole where the wind rushed in even stronger. Alao jumped to his feet. "This hut is falling apart. We will be buried under the rubble." Dimeji remained seated. "The walls are strong. They will hold." Alao glared at him. "You are a fool. I'm not going to sit here and die." With that, he bolted. He ran out into the rain, disappearing into the darkness. Dimeji closed his eyes, ignoring the cold and the pounding of the rain. The test was not about comfort. It was about endurance. He stayed. The storm raged for hours, but Dimeji did not move. He stayed through the wind, through the cold, through the endless downpour. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, the rain had stopped. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth and new beginnings. The villagers gathered outside the hut, eager to see the result. Baba Ade stood at the front, his arms crossed. Dimeji, shivering but steady, stepped out of the hut. Alao was nowhere to be seen. Baba Ade nodded. "You have passed the second test." A cheer rose from the crowd, but Dimeji barely heard it. He was exhausted, his muscles stiff, his body aching from the long night. Aduni stepped forward, her eyes filled with something he could not quite name, pride, perhaps, or something deeper. She handed him a dry cloth. "You stayed," she said softly. Dimeji managed a small smile. "A fisherman does not leave the river just because the waters are rough." Aduni's smile widened. Meanwhile, Alao returned, his fine clothes muddy, his face filled with frustration. "This was not a fair test," he snapped. "What does standing in the rain prove?" Baba Ade turned to him. "It proves that when things get hard, a real man does not run." Alao opened his mouth to argue, but saw the way the villagers looked at him. He knew he had already lost their respect. Baba Ade turned back to Dimeji. "Tomorrow is the final test. Rest well, fisherman." As Dimeji walked away, he felt something shift inside him. He had not won Aduni's hand yet, but he had proven something to himself. He was stronger than he had thought, and he would not give up now. The morning after the storm was calm. The sky was clear, the air smelled fresh, and the village of Apon slowly came back to life. Women went to the stream to fetch water, children ran barefoot through the muddy paths, and men gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about the events of the night before. Everyone knew what had happened. They had seen Alao flee the hut in the middle of the storm while Dimeji stayed. The villagers talked about it with excitement. Alao ran like a frightened goat. But Dimeji, the fisherman, did not move. What will Baba Ade do now? Dimeji, sore from the long wet night, sat outside his mother's hut. His body ached, his clothes were still damp, but his heart was steady. 2 tests were done. Only one remained. His mother, Mama Dimeji, brought him a bowl of hot pap and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You have done well, my son." Dimeji nodded. "But it is not over yet." "No, it is not," she agreed, "but you have shown them who you are." He took a sip of the warm pap, letting the heat chase away the cold that still clung to him. "What do you think the final test will be?" His mother smiled. "Only Baba Ade knows." Later that morning, Baba Ade stood in the village square, waiting for Dimeji and Alao. The villagers gathered once more, eager to see what the old hunter had planned. Dimeji arrived first, his steps slow but sure. Alao came shortly after, his fine clothes neat again, though his expression was tight with frustration. Baba Ade studied them both before speaking. "You have both faced challenges to prove yourselves," he said. "You have hunted, you have endured the storm, but there is one final test." He turned and pointed toward the center of the square, where a large pile of wood and stones had been arranged. On top sat a small iron pot. "This is the final test," Baba Ade said. "A man must not only provide and protect, he must also build." A murmur spread through the crowd. Baba Ade continued, "Each of you will build a fire and prepare a meal for the village. You will be given the same ingredients. The man who makes the best meal, one that truly nourishes, will prove he is ready to care for a family." Alao frowned. "You want us to cook?" Baba Ade's eyes were firm. "Yes," Alao scoffed. "That is a woman's duty." Baba Ade shook his head. "A man who cannot prepare food for his family is not a man. A husband must not only expect to be served, he must be able to serve." Dimeji, who had grown up cooking fish over an open flame, simply nodded. Alao, however, looked uneasy. Both men were given the same ingredients: yams, fish, palm oil, peppers, onions, and spices. They were also given firewood, water, and small cooking pots. The challenge was simple: prepare a meal that was good enough to feed the elders and prove their worth. Dimeji worked quickly. He started by lighting his fire, placing the wood carefully so it would burn evenly. The flames rose steadily, warming his hands. Alao, on the other hand, struggled. He had never built a fire before. His hands were clumsy with the wood, and soon thick smoke rose from his pile, stinging his eyes. Dimeji peeled the yams, sliced them into even pieces, and set them aside. Then he cleaned the fish carefully, removing the scales and gutting it with practiced ease. He seasoned it with salt and spices, rubbing them deep into the flesh. Alao, growing frustrated, finally managed to get his fire going, but it burned too hot, charring the edges of his wood before he could even start cooking. He cursed under his breath, but forced himself to continue. Dimeji poured water into his pot, letting it boil before adding the yams. He then set the fish on a flat stone over the fire, roasting it slowly so the skin crisped without burning. The scent of spice and smoke filled the air. Alao, in his frustration, dumped everything into his pot at once: yams, fish, oil, and spices, without care for the order. His fire was too strong, causing the water to evaporate too quickly. The smell that rose was not pleasant. The villagers watched in amusement. They could already see who would win. After some time, Baba Ade called for the elders. The food was ready. Dimeji served his meal carefully, placing the roasted fish beside the soft yams, drizzling palm oil over it, and adding a sprinkle of fresh pepper. The dish was simple, but it smelled rich and inviting. Alao, however, presented a thick, burnt mess. The yams were undercooked in some places and overcooked in others. The fish had fallen apart into the sauce, making it look unappetizing. The elders took their first bites. Baba Ade ate slowly, chewing thoughtfully. The other elders did the same. The villagers held their breath. Then, Baba Ade nodded. Dimeji's food is well-balanced, well-prepared, and nourishing. He turned to Alao, his expression unreadable. Alao's food is an effort. The crowd laughed quietly. Baba Ade set down his plate and turned to the two men. A man must not only work hard, he must work with patience and wisdom. A husband is not only a provider, he is a builder, a protector, and a nurturer. A man who cannot care for the small things will fail at the great things. He faced Dimeji. "You have proven that you understand what it means to be a husband." Then he turned to Alao. "You have shown that wealth alone does not make a man." Alao's face burned with anger. "This is foolish. I have more wealth than this fisherman will ever have. How can you deny me?" Baba Ade's expression was calm. "Because you think wealth is enough, but a marriage built only on riches will collapse when hardship comes." Alao scowled. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then snapped it shut. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his pride wounded. Baba Ade faced Dimeji. "You have won." The village erupted in cheers. Aduni stepped forward, her eyes shining. She looked at her father, then at Dimeji. "You have my blessing," Baba Ade said. Dimeji let out a slow breath, relief washing over him. He turned to Aduni, his heart full. "I promised you I would stand for you." She smiled. "And you did." The villagers celebrated late into the night. Drums were played, songs were sung, and food was shared. Dimeji sat beside Aduni, watching the flames of the fire dance against the night sky. She leaned closer and whispered, "Are you ready to build a life with me?" Dimeji smiled. "I have been ready for a long time." And under the same moon that had watched them since childhood, they began a new journey together. Not just as friends, but as partners, ready to face whatever came their way. The day after the final test, the village of Apon was alive with excitement. Word had spread that Baba Ade had given his blessing for Aduni and Dimeji to marry. Women gathered in small groups, discussing the events of the past few days. Did you see how Dimeji stood in the storm, and the way he prepared his meal with care? Even Baba Ade, the great hunter, could not deny that Dimeji is a real man. Though some still whispered about how Alao had left in anger, most agreed that Baba Ade had made the right choice. Dimeji sat outside his mother's hut, deep in thought. The tests were over, but now came something even greater: marriage. His mother, Mama Dimeji, came out and sat beside him. "You are quiet, my son." Dimeji sighed. "I have won Baba Ade's blessing, but now I must prove myself as a husband." Mama Dimeji smiled. "You have always been ready, Dimeji. Marriage is not about being perfect, it is about growing together." He nodded, but he still felt the weight of responsibility. Later that day, he visited Baba Ade's compound to discuss the marriage arrangements. Baba Ade sat under the large mango tree, his hunting knife resting beside him. "Dimeji," he greeted. "Baba," Dimeji said, bowing respectfully. Baba Ade studied him for a moment. "You have passed my tests, but marriage is more than trials. It is a lifetime of choices. Are you ready for that?" Dimeji met his gaze. "Yes, Baba. I will care for Aduni with all that I have." Baba Ade nodded. "Then we must begin the bride price negotiations." In Apon, like many villages, a man did not simply take a wife, he honored her family by offering a bride price. It was a symbol of respect, not a purchase. The next day, both families gathered. Baba Ade sat with the elders of his family, while Mama Dimeji and Dimeji's uncles sat on the other side. A village elder spoke first. "Baba Ade, your daughter is a woman of great worth. Dimeji has shown his strength, but what do you ask for her hand?" Baba Ade took a deep breath. "I do not seek wealth. I ask only for 10 tubers of yam, 1 calabash of palm oil, and a goat, not because I need them, but so Dimeji understands that marriage requires effort." Dimeji's uncles nodded. "These are fair requests." Dimeji spoke up. "I will bring these things, Baba." Baba Ade smiled slightly. "Then we will set the wedding day." As the village prepared for the wedding, not everyone was pleased. Alao, the wealthy trader, had left in anger after losing the final test. But his pride was still wounded. He could not believe that Baba Ade had chosen a simple fisherman over him. One evening, as Aduni walked home from the market, she heard a voice behind her. "Aduni." She turned and saw Alao standing there, his fine clothes still spotless, his gold bracelets shining. She frowned. "Why are you here?" Alao stepped closer. "You do not have to marry Dimeji." Aduni crossed her arms. "I have made my choice." Alao's jaw tightened. "Dimeji is nothing. He has no wealth, no status." Aduni lifted her chin. "But he has love, patience, and strength. That is more valuable than gold." Alao scoffed. "You are making a mistake." Aduni met his gaze. "The only mistake would have been choosing a man who believes wealth is greater than love." She turned and walked away, leaving Alao standing there, his fists clenched in frustration. The days leading to the wedding were filled with music and laughter. Women pounded yam, men brewed palm wine, and the sound of drums echoed through the village. Dimeji worked harder than ever, catching fish to provide for the feast. Aduni, surrounded by the women of the village, was dressed in fine wrappers, her hair braided beautifully. On the night before the wedding, Aduni sat with her mother. "My daughter," Mama Aduni said, "marriage is not always easy. There will be days of joy and days of struggle." Aduni nodded. "I know, Mama." Her mother squeezed her hand. "But a strong marriage is built on respect, patience, and love. Never forget that." Aduni smiled. "I will remember." The wedding day arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze. The entire village gathered in the square, dressed in their finest clothes. Dimeji, wearing a new tunic woven by his mother, stood with the elders as Baba Ade brought Aduni forward. She was radiant, her smile bright. Baba Ade faced Dimeji. "You have proven yourself. Take care of my daughter." Dimeji bowed. "With all my heart." Palm wine was shared, blessings were given, and the celebration began. Drums pounded, people danced, and laughter filled the air. As night fell, Aduni and Dimeji sat together watching the moon. "We did it," Aduni whispered. Dimeji smiled. "No, we are just beginning." And under the moon that had watched over them since childhood, they started their journey together. Not as two people, but as one. After the wedding feast, the village of Apon slowly quieted. The pounding of the drums, which had carried the rhythm of celebration deep into the night, began to fade. The laughter of the villagers softened as people returned to their huts, their hearts full from the joyous occasion. The fires that had burned bright in the village square flickered lower, their golden glow casting long shadows on the dusty ground. Dimeji and Aduni stood side by side, watching as the last of the guests departed. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, palm wine, and the faint sweetness of crushed flowers scattered during the ceremony. It had been a day unlike any other, a day of music, of dancing, of blessings. But now, the festivities were over, and the reality of marriage stood before them. For the first time since their childhood, they were alone. Their home, a small hut built near the river's edge, awaited them. It was not grand, but it was strong, built by Dimeji's hands with the help of his friends. The walls were made of sun-dried mud bricks, thick and sturdy to keep the cool air in during the heat of the day. The roof was thatched with palm fronds, woven tightly to protect against rain. A small wooden door stood open, inviting them into their new life together. Aduni reached out and ran her fingers over the carved wood of the doorframe. "You built this," she murmured, a soft smile touching her lips. Dimeji nodded. "For us." She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with quiet admiration. "It is beautiful." Inside, the hut was simple but carefully arranged. A woven sleeping mat lay in one corner, covered with a soft cloth that Aduni's mother had gifted them. A wooden table, made by one of the village carpenters, stood in the center of the room. Against the wall, baskets of food, dried fish, yams, and grains, were stacked neatly, gifts from family and friends. Aduni stepped inside first, her movements slow and deliberate. She took in every detail, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the table, the familiar scent of fresh palm oil and herbs filling the air. It felt strange, this new space, this new life. It was hers, but also his. It was no longer just her father's home, no longer the place where she had spent her days as a daughter. Now she was a wife. Dimeji followed, closing the door gently behind him. The room was quiet, save for the distant croaking of frogs from the river and the rustling of palm leaves in the night wind. He sat on the mat, stretching his legs out in front of him. "It still feels like a dream," he admitted. Aduni sat beside him, smoothing her hands over her lap. "A good dream." He turned his head slightly to look at her, his gaze steady. "Are you happy?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the clay pot of water sitting near the door, pouring a small amount into a wooden cup. She took a sip before passing it to him. He drank, the cool water soothing his throat after the long day. Finally, she spoke. "Happiness is not something that comes on its own. It is something we build, day by day." Dimeji thought about her words. He had always believed that love was enough, that the feeling in his heart, the way he looked at her, the way she smiled at him, was all that mattered. But she was right. Love was not just a moment. It was a journey. It was the quiet evenings after long days, the shared meals, the struggles, and the triumphs. It was the choice to keep choosing each other every day. He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "Then, let us build." Aduni nodded, squeezing his hand gently. Together. For a long moment, they sat in silence, listening to the night. The moon cast a pale glow through the small window, illuminating their faces. The village, once alive with celebration, was now still. Dimeji's thoughts drifted to the future. He had spent so much time proving himself, fighting for the right to be here with her. But marriage was not a prize. It was a responsibility. He had promised Baba Ade that he would take care of Aduni, that he would never let her go hungry. Those words were not just for the moment. They were for a lifetime. "I will take care of you," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. Aduni smiled. "And I will take care of you." A breeze drifted through the window, rustling the light curtain Aduni had hung earlier that morning. It carried the scent of wet earth, the remnants of the storm that had passed days before. The air was cool, wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. Dimeji lay back on the mat, staring at the ceiling. "Do you remember when we used to sit by the river as children, making up stories about the moon?" Aduni laughed, the sound light and familiar. "Yes, you always said the moon was watching us." He turned his head toward her. "Maybe it still is." She met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Then let it watch." Slowly, the weight of the day settled over them. The exhaustion from the celebration, the emotions of the wedding, the excitement, the nervousness, all of it blended into a quiet peace. Aduni shifted, lying down beside him. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Dimeji closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. The moon shone through the window, casting its silver light over them. The river whispered in the distance, its steady flow a reminder that life moved forward, always. Tonight, they had begun their journey. Tomorrow, they would continue building, and they would build together. The first few days of marriage passed in a blur of quiet adjustments. There was no longer the excitement of the wedding, no longer the constant stream of visitors bringing gifts and blessings. The songs had faded, the dances had ended, and life had settled into something slower, something real. For Aduni, the reality of marriage was both familiar and unfamiliar. She had always known how to manage a home. She had learned from her mother, from the other village women. But now, this home was her own. There were no other women moving around, no father or brothers to fill the space with their presence. It was just her and Dimeji, and the silence that sometimes sat between them, comfortable but heavy. Dimeji, too, felt the shift. The days were much the same as before. He woke before the sun, walked down to the river, cast his nets, and hoped for a good catch. But now, there was something different. Now, there was someone waiting for him when he returned. Someone who looked up when he walked through the door, who noticed the tension in his shoulders when his nets came back empty. One particular morning, Dimeji rose earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, the stars fading as the first hints of light stretched across the horizon. He moved quietly so as not to wake Aduni, though he knew she would rise soon to begin her own work. At the riverbank, he met the other fishermen. Some were older men who had spent their entire lives casting nets into the water. Others were young boys just beginning to learn the trade. They greeted one another in low voices, their movements practiced and efficient. The water was calm, a deep, endless blue in the dim light of dawn. Dimeji pushed his canoe into the water, stepping in and grabbing his paddle. The air was thick with the scent of the river, earthy, damp, familiar. He rowed out to his usual spot, where the water was deeper, where the fish often gathered. He cast his net, watching as it spread across the surface before sinking. Then, he waited. The minutes passed. The sun began to rise. The river shifted slightly, small ripples moving across its surface. But when Dimeji pulled in his net, it was empty. Frowning, he tried again, and again. By midday, he had caught only 2 small fish, far less than what he needed. The other fishermen were having the same luck. The river was not giving today. Dimeji sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. This was part of life. Some days were plentiful, others were not. But today, of all days, he had wanted to return home with a full catch. He had wanted to prove, even if only to himself, that he could provide. As he rowed back to shore, he thought of Aduni. What would he say to her? Would she be disappointed? Would she worry? When Dimeji returned home, Aduni was outside, grinding pepper with a wooden mortar and pestle. She looked up as he approached, her eyes scanning him, noticing the way he carried himself, the tension in his shoulders. She stood, wiping her hands on her wrapper. "You are back." Dimeji nodded, setting his small catch down. The river was not kind today. Aduni glanced at the 2 fish, then at her husband. She could see the frustration behind his calm expression. She stepped forward and touched his arm. "Then we will share what we have." Dimeji looked at her, surprised by how simple, how easy her response was. He had expected her to be worried, maybe even disappointed, but she was neither. Together, they cleaned the fish. Aduni took only what was needed, stretching the meal with roasted yams and palm oil. As they sat down to eat, she spoke of other things, of the women she had met at the market, of the news she had heard from the neighboring village. She did not dwell on the empty nets, and neither did he. As the night fell, Dimeji lay awake, staring at the thatched ceiling. Love, he realized, was not just about the grand moments. It was in the small things. It was in the way Aduni did not complain, in the way she shared his burdens without making them heavier. He reached for her hand in the darkness and squeezed it gently. She squeezed back. They would endure. A change in routine. The next morning, before Dimeji left for the river, Aduni handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "What is this?" he asked. "Food," she said simply. "You leave early, and you do not eat until you return. That is not good." Dimeji hesitated, then took the bundle. It was a small thing, but it warmed him in a way he could not explain. That day, as he worked, he felt different. He still cast his nets, still waited with patience, but there was something lighter in his chest. When he took a break, he unwrapped the bundle Aduni had given him, a small piece of roasted yam and dried fish. He ate slowly, savoring each bite. It was not just food, it was care. It was love, wrapped in cloth and given without words. When he returned home that evening, his catch was better than the day before. Not great, but better. Aduni met him at the door, smiling. "The river was kinder today?" Dimeji nodded. "A little." She took the fish from him and began to clean them. "Tomorrow, it will be better." And he believed her. But not all struggles were small ones. One evening, just as they were finishing dinner, a visitor arrived at their door. It was an elder from the village council. His face was lined with age, his eyes wise but serious. "Dimeji," the elder greeted. Dimeji stood, bowing slightly. "Elder, welcome." The old man nodded, stepping forward. "I bring news. There is talk among some villagers that you should not have won Aduni's hand." Dimeji felt his stomach tighten. "Why?" The elder sighed. "You know how people are. Some still believe Allah was the better choice. They say wealth would have provided more security for Aduni." Dimeji clenched his jaw. He had worked hard. He had endured every test. Yet still, there were those who doubted. The elder placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not let their words trouble you. What matters is how you build your life now." After the elder left, Dimeji sat in silence. Aduni watched him, then moved closer. "Does this trouble you?" He hesitated. "It does not feel good to know people still doubt me." Aduni reached for his hand. "Let them talk. They do not know you as I do." Dimeji exhaled slowly. She was right. He could not control what others thought. He could only keep moving forward. As the days passed, their routines became smoother. Aduni managed the home, trading small goods at the market when needed. Dimeji continued to fish, learning the river's patterns, understanding its moods. They faced difficulties, yes. Some days were hard, some nights were long, but they faced them together. The months passed, and Aduni's belly grew round with new life. The village women had noticed first, pointing at the subtle change in the way she moved, in the way she touched her stomach absent-mindedly as she worked. Soon, the whispers turned into congratulations, and before long, every woman who passed her in the market had a piece of advice to offer. "Eat plenty of ground nuts," an elderly woman told her one morning. "It will make the baby strong." Another woman, a mother of 6, leaned in and whispered, "Sing to your belly every night. The baby will know your voice before it even enters the world." Others had their own beliefs. Some said she should not stand in the doorway for too long, lest the baby become stubborn. Others advised her to tie a small charm around her waist for protection. Aduni smiled at them all, listening with patience. Some advice she took to heart, some she let drift away like the wind. She knew that every mother had her own way, her own wisdom passed down from her mother before her. Dimeji's joy and fear. Dimeji, too, changed with the news. When Aduni first told him, he had stood in stunned silence for a moment, as if his mind needed time to catch up with what his heart already knew. Then, he had pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. "We are going to be parents," he whispered, almost as if saying it out loud would make it more real. As the months went on, he worked harder than ever. He rose earlier, cast his nets farther, and walked to neighboring villages to trade his fish for yams, grains, and oil. He built a small wooden crib with his own hands, carving patterns into the edges in the evenings after his work was done. But beneath his excitement, there was something else, a quiet fear that he did not speak aloud. What if something went wrong? What if the river did not provide enough? What if he was not enough? One evening, as they sat outside watching the moon, Aduni placed his hand on her stomach. "Do you feel that?" A small movement, a tiny kick. Dimeji's eyes widened. He is strong. Aduni laughed softly. Or she, Dimeji smiled. Or she. His fears, though still present, seemed smaller in that moment. Life changed quickly after Ifeoluwa's birth. The once quiet hut was now filled with new sounds. Soft cries in the middle of the night, the gentle cooing of the baby, the rustling of cloth as Aduni rocked him to sleep. Dimeji learned new things: how to wrap the baby in a cloth sling, how to soothe him when he cried, how to appreciate the small moments, like the way Ifeoluwa's tiny fingers curled around his own. The village welcomed the child with open arms. The elders blessed him, the women fussed over him, and the children peeked curiously into the hut, eager to catch a glimpse of the newest member of their community. One evening, as Dimeji sat by the river with his son sleeping against his chest, he thought about how much had changed. Once, he had been just a fisherman, unsure of his future, afraid of what lay ahead. Now, he was a husband, a father, a man with responsibilities far greater than himself. Aduni came to sit beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you still worry?" she asked softly. Dimeji looked down at their son, his heart swelling. "Yes," he admitted, "but not in the way I used to." Aduni smiled. "That means you are a good father," Dimeji chuckled, "or just a man trying his best." She took his hand in hers. "That is the same thing." The river flowed steadily beside them, the water reflecting the silver light of the moon. The world was quiet, peaceful. Dimeji closed his eyes, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling the warmth of his family beside him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. The first year of Ifeoluwa's life was filled with joy, laughter, and sleepless nights. Dimeji and Aduni adjusted to parenthood slowly, learning the rhythm of their son's needs. The soft cries in the middle of the night, the tiny fists reaching for comfort, the laughter that filled the small hut when he was happy. But just as the river had its calm and stormy days, so too did life. Hardship came when they least expected it, testing not just their love, but their resilience. The season of heavy rains arrived earlier than usual that year. At first, it was welcome. The earth drank deeply, and the farmers rejoiced as their crops flourished. The river swelled, providing fish in abundance. But soon, the rains became relentless. Day after day, the sky remained gray, the wind howling through the village. The river, once a steady friend, grew angry. The water rose higher, creeping closer to the homes built along its edge. Dimeji watched the river carefully, sensing its warning. He had seen it flood before, had heard the stories from the elders about how, years ago, it had swallowed parts of the village whole. One evening, as he sat outside mending his fishing net, Aduni stepped out of the hut with Ifeoluwa strapped to her back. She looked at the sky, worry creasing her forehead. "The rain is not stopping," she said. Dimeji nodded. "I know." That night, he could not sleep. The rain drummed against the thatched roof, and the wind pushed against the walls of their hut. The air felt heavy, as if something was about to break. And then, it did. In the middle of the night, a great cry echoed through the village. "The river! The river is coming!" Dimeji shot up from his mat, heart pounding. Aduni gasped, clutching Ifeoluwa tightly. Outside, chaos erupted. Villagers ran through the muddy paths, shouting warnings, carrying what little they could save. Dimeji stepped out of the hut and froze. The river had spilled over its banks. Water rushed through the village, carrying away baskets, pots, even small livestock. The homes closest to the river, those with weaker walls, collapsed under the force. "Dimeji," Aduni called from inside. He turned back to her, eyes sharp. "We need to leave, now." He grabbed a bundle of essentials, dried food, a blanket, a small clay pot of drinking water. He lifted Ifeoluwa into his arms while Aduni held onto his arm. The water had reached their doorstep. They waded through it carefully, the coldness biting at their skin. Around them, families scrambled for higher ground. Children clung to their parents. Elders were carried on the backs of their sons. Dimeji led Aduni toward Baba Ade's compound, which was built on slightly higher land. When they arrived, they found dozens of villagers already gathered there, shivering and wet. Baba Ade stood at the entrance, his expression grim. "The river is not done," he said. "We must be ready." By morning, the rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Homes had been destroyed. Food storage huts had been washed away. The river had swallowed entire parts of the village, leaving behind a landscape of mud and broken structures. Dimeji and Aduni's hut was among those lost. For a moment, Dimeji simply stood where his home had been, staring at the muddy ruin. The fishing nets he had carefully woven, the wooden crib he had carved for Ifeoluwa, gone. Aduni stepped beside him, quiet. She placed a hand on his arm. "We will rebuild," she said softly. Dimeji turned to her, searching her face. There was no anger, no despair, only quiet strength. He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yes, we will." The seasons passed, and the village of Apon recovered from the flood. The river, once an angry force that had swept away homes and livelihoods, had returned to its steady rhythm, as if apologizing for its destruction. Life, too, found its balance again. New huts were built, crops were replanted, and the fishermen returned to the waters. For Dimeji and Aduni, the hardships had left their mark, not in the form of scars, but in the quiet way they understood each other now. Their love had been tested, their patience stretched, yet through it all, they had remained unshaken. Ifeoluwa grew quickly, his laughter filling their home, his small feet running across the soft dirt outside their hut. He was a curious child, always watching, always asking questions. One day, as Dimeji sat repairing his fishing net under the shade of a palm tree, Ifeoluwa climbed onto his lap, his tiny fingers touching the coarse ropes. "Baba, what are you doing?" the boy asked, tilting his head. Dimeji smiled. "Fixing my net so I can catch fish tomorrow." Ifeoluwa frowned, deep in thought. "Can I help?" Dimeji chuckled, pulling his son closer. "Not yet, my son. First, you must learn patience." Ifeoluwa pouted but stayed quiet, watching his father's hands move with careful precision. Aduni, standing nearby, laughed softly. "He is just like you, Dimeji, always eager to learn." Dimeji glanced up at his wife, his heart swelling. "He is strong like his mother," he said. Aduni smiled, placing a hand on her belly. Dimeji paused. His eyes widened as he realized what she was telling him. "Another?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Aduni nodded. Dimeji exhaled, a slow smile spreading across his face. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. They had built this life together, and now it was growing. This is Z World Folktales. Thanks for watching. Please tell us what you think about our story. Share your thoughts in the comment section. We would love to know what you think. If you love this story, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Don't forget to turn on the notification button so you never miss out on our new stories. Thank you once again for watching. See you in the next story. Bye.